Test 1, 2.
Be with you today. I see so many friends out across the audience today, and I'll give a shout out to Maynard. Maynard, raise your hand back there. Everybody, look at this gentleman here. His mother was my first grade teacher in Stanton, Iowa. So Francis was one of my favorite teachers ever. And so thanks for coming out today. It's good to see you. And so, yeah, it is great to be back in Ames, Iowa. It's like a second home to me. I did spend my very formative years going through college right here at Iowa State University. So thank you, Dr. Winterstein, for your wonderful leadership. It's great to see you, and Sophia as well, and so many others. I really appreciate the time and attention today. And I'm going to focus my discussion today on the war in Ukraine. And I know that we see images every day, we hear about it, and I'll be able to share a little bit with you about what's going on right now. And then I'm happy to take questions, and it can be on any topic, whether you want to focus on Ukraine and Russia or you have other interests. I'm absolutely ready and willing to take those questions. So a little bit about what we see going on. And I'm actually going to take you back a little bit. Many of you have heard my connection to Ukraine, but I'll share a little bit with you right now. My first interaction with Ukraine was actually in 1989. And I, at that time, was between my freshman and sophomore year here at Iowa State University. And I engaged in an agricultural exchange. It wasn't sponsored by ISU, it was through a different organization. And there were 18 students from Iowa that were selected to go on this ag exchange, live on a collective farm in Ukraine. And if you think back, a lot of you are, similar in age to me. So you remember that it was part of the Soviet Union at that time. And so the Ag Exchange took this group of young Iowa men and women into rural Ukraine to a community called Lazavatka, which was part of the May 1st collective farm in the Cherkasy Oblast. And little did we know at that time where we would be today. Of course, the Ag Exchange, it was several weeks over the summer. We engaged in agriculture with our host families. Each of us were placed in a different family within that community. The following summer, then, we completed the exchange by hosting our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. And so they stayed on our family farm. We actually hosted not only my Ukrainian sister, but two of her friends as well from that collective. And they stayed with my family, engaged in our family farming during that summer, and then they returned to Ukraine. The following year is when Ukraine separated from the Soviet Union. We saw all of those Soviet bloc countries come apart and become independent nations. And that is exactly what the Ukrainians were hoping for. When I first visited Ukraine in 1989, they very much wanted to be a free and sovereign nation, and they did achieve that. What they are facing today now is it's horrifying for all of us to see what is happening. So Russia has invaded. They entered Ukraine in March, and we have seen this war going on for much, much longer than anyone ever anticipated. Our military intelligence was telling us that once Russia invades, they will have such superiority that Ukraine will fall within 3 to 5 days. It was our intelligence that was telling us this. What they didn't consider was that the Russians have a very antiquated way of fighting in wars. They are very top heavy. and they rely on orders coming from the very highest echelons of their military. So once they have lost various lines of communication, the soldiers on the ground really don't know what to do because nobody's there telling them what to do. So that has hampered their efforts, as well as from the other side, the Ukrainian army has demonstrated a might and a will that was far underestimated. And the resistance that is coming from the communities. So Vladimir Putin right now is surrounded by only 3-4 most senior advisors. He has separated himself from most everybody else. He is very much isolated. He rules in a way that if you disagree, you disappear. So a lot of his senior advisors may not be advising him of what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. So because we see that happening, the Russian military has really struggled. So Putin's not faced with the reality on the ground, and the military is not sure what to do next. So the resistance in Ukraine has stepped up, and you have maybe even seen the images of these 80-year-old women that will go out into the streets and stand in front of the tanks that are trying to advance. And that's not at all what the Russian military anticipated. What they had been told was that when you enter into Ukraine, you will be greeted with men and women bearing food and gifts for you and flowers because you are liberating this country from its Nazi leaders, which is actually pretty funny because Zelensky is Jewish. But so there was this big fabrication of what was going to happen in Ukraine. And the Russians they just didn't anticipate what they were faced with. So just recently, and I've been a huge advocate for Ukraine and pushing back on the Russian military using Ukrainian forces. So that's where I am. We don't want to engage American military forces. We are afraid that if we're directly engaging with the Russians, it would trigger Article 5 of NATO, which would really, truly, you've heard the expression, but take us into World War III. And we don't want that to happen. So we are enabling the Ukrainians to fight as best as we can. We are providing humanitarian assistance. We are providing levels of military assistance as well. We are bolstering our NATO partners in Europe any way that we can. And you've seen Congress act in an extremely bipartisan manner to support Ukraine. And you have seen the president use his drawdown authority as he's drawing down what Congress has set aside for him and providing those dollars for the purchase of humanitarian assistance as well as military assistance. So we're all trying to work in conjunction. I'm a little more out in front. I push the administration very hard. I push my colleagues very hard. We do need Ukraine as a buffer between Europe and NATO and Russia. If Ukraine falls, this will not be the end of Russia. They will not be satisfied with just Ukraine. They have aspirations of Moldova, which is another non-NATO nation. It is very poor. It's the poorest of the European countries. It is just ripe to be targeted by Russia next. Russia actually does have 1,500 Russian soldiers already in Moldova. They have been there for a very long time, but that sets the stage if Russia comes across southern Ukraine for them to enter into Moldova. And then there are other countries. You may know of Kosovo. Kosovo is in the state partnership program with the state of Iowa through our Iowa Army National Guard. I had a very interesting conversation with their prime minister not all that long ago, and their prime minister is sharing concerns that should Ukraine fall, should Russia start pushing into some of these other countries, they are very afraid because Serbia has a relationship with Russia. that they would see Serbian forces backed by Russia start to engage in Kosovo as well, having Russians as a backer. So this domino effect that we would see in Europe is pretty significant. And we feel it already with the instability that's happening in Europe because of this conflict. So just recently, I did lead a bipartisan delegation to Germany and Poland. It was 10 senators total, Republicans, Democrats. Actually, it's tripartisan because Angus King went with us and he's an independent. So a tripartisan delegation of 10 senators. This is the largest delegation of United States senators since before COVID. It is very difficult to get 10 senators to agree on anything and to travel together. So we pulled together this group. I led the delegation. I did get Kirsten Gillibrand to engage as well. And many of you know, she is one of my best friends in the Senate. We believe very different things, but when we find things that we agree on, man, we are 100% and we are go, go, go. So she was my Democratic lead on that delegation. And it was a phenomenal trip, a great fact-finding mission, as well as we used the delegation to bolster our support for NATO and just reaffirm to those NATO members that the United States is here, we are engaging, and we will be there as partners as we push back against Russia and their nefarious goals. So we were able to visit with leadership in Germany and in Poland. We also visited our American troops that have been called forward as part of that NATO effort. So we were able to visit with them in Germany, and the 82nd Airborne Division has a number of people that are already stationed in Poland. So I was able to pull some Iowans out of those groups and visit with them and hear about their experiences on the ground. So that was very interesting. We just told them, thank you so much for your service, and just explained to them how important this is for the United States and our allies across Europe. So we do get some pushback and they're like, oh, why do we have troops there? We are just part of the presence. So right now, Poland actually is bearing the brunt of the weight in Europe. They have their troops on the border with Ukraine, backed by the United States, backed by members from other NATO countries. So it's not our troops that are out on the front lines necessarily in Poland. We are very reliant on a number of those other partners. We're all working together in Europe to push back against Russia. So we also were able to visit a refugee center in Poland. And this was probably the most heartbreaking part of the trip. And if you have ever visited a refugee center, welcome center before, it's really hard to hear some of the stories coming from those refugees. And this particular center was about 3 miles from the Ukrainian border. And there are a number of those up and down the border, and they process thousands of refugees that are fleeing every day. Most of those refugees will be women and children and the elderly, because right now Ukraine does have restriction on men that are military age. They will use those men for military action as necessary. So the younger men are staying in Ukraine. So there are a lot of families that are fleeing out of these areas that are being shelled by the Russians. Many of these women did not want to leave, and they left dragging their children with them, each of them with just maybe one bag of clothing or personal items, whatever they can flee with. So my Ukrainian sister from 1989, I'm in touch with her, and she and her husband are school teachers. Now, her daughter is a little bit older than my own daughter. Her daughter is 26. She has an elderly mother that she has that lives just a block away from her. She does not live on the collective anymore. She's in a town that is called Mykolaiv, which if you watch the news, it'll pop up every so often. It is a port city on the Black Sea. It's one of their main shipbuilding areas, and it is being shelled. Every day it is being shelved. She and her husband had converted their schoolhouse into a refugee resting point, a place of refuge. And it is now at a point where her superiors have said, we need to move people out. It is far too dangerous to house them there. And this is worrying me because the last time I heard from her was 5 days ago. We communicate every day. So I am very worried. Our communication towards the beginning of the war was that I'm staying, I'm needed here. She and the other women at the school were making food for the Ukrainian soldiers. And in our most recent communications, you could tell that she was getting much more worried. And she said, many of my friends have already gone abroad. And she said, I am trying to decide whether my daughter and my mother and I should leave. And then she said, but I will come back. So I haven't heard from her since last Thursday, Friday. So I'm not sure if she has left the area, but it is devastating. And for a while, they weren't receiving refugees because the Russians were not allowing those women and children to pass through their ranks. And then all of a sudden they got a number of families through, but now the shelling has become so dangerous that they need to keep them moving. So it has been very frustrating for us just to watch what's going on with this war. Many of us feel very helpless, and we're providing, believe me, as Congress, we are trying to provide everything we can, and we're pushing our Department of Defense to move as quickly as possible when they're transferring the weapons, the munitions, because every day that they stall or delay, it is lives that are lost. And most of those lives are innocent civilians. The Russians are indiscriminate in their bombing, they're indiscriminate in their killing, and we see a lot of war crimes that are being committed against those that are part of a very helpless population right now. We know that humanitarian supplies are not getting through easily into the areas that are occupied by Russian soldiers. Jake Tapper, who is a CNN correspondent, he is in Ukraine right now, and he sent a tweet this morning that my staff forwarded to me. One of the non-governmental organizations that has been taking in food and supplies, humanitarian supplies, 9 of them were taken by the Russians, and they have not been seen since. So it's a dire circumstance. The Russian soldiers just draw no lines. They draw no lines, and it's extremely concerning. So moving maybe away from the country, but the impact of the war on the rest of the world as well. We have come to find out that many, not just the United States, but many other countries are heavily reliant upon Russia for their energy needs and their energy consumption through the petroleum products that will come out of Russia. And just in the United States in 2021, just last year, we hit an all-time high with the amount of Russian oil that was being imported into the United States. And every day, Americans were consuming 672,000 barrels of Russian oil a day. So we have got to sever our ties to Russia, and that becomes very difficult. In the Senate the other day, we did pass bipartisan. I think it might have been maybe 98-1, or it was overwhelming. We did pass a ban on Russian oil. We'll see where this goes, but that was the Senate speaking. So we are hoping that as the United States, we can separate ourselves from Russian oil, which is predominantly the source of revenue that Vladimir Putin is using to fund the war in Ukraine. So we see efforts ongoing across Europe as well. There are debates in many of the legislatures and parliaments on how they can separate themselves from Russian oil. The problem is, of course, we are huge consumers of energy. We need to figure out how to backfill that gap. I know the administration is very heavy on clean energy. They want to see us move to electric vehicles, but folks, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. So we have had this huge push, not only to reopen some of the sources of American energy, American oil, but also, hey, right here in the Midwest, we've got lots of ethanol. We can produce a lot of biodiesel. Come on, folks. So we have been pushing the administration in a bipartisan way. Amy Klobuchar, Chuck Grassley, me, a number of others across the Midwest have really been pushing the administration on a readily available source of energy. It's our biofuels. And, I know that the president is coming into Iowa tomorrow. I really hope he's heard our message there. So we'll hear what he has to say. But we are going to continue on that push and make sure that they're utilizing this readily available source of energy. So we're going to keep on that. If you want to track it, it's called the Homefront Energy Independence Act, and it actually would replace every barrel of oil that comes into the United States from Russia. We've heard from our industry leaders in biofuels that they can backfill. They can do it today. Backfill the amount of oil that's coming in from Russia. Yeah, I think so too. Thank you. So we can do that. One other area that is very concerning too is the global food security issue. And Russia and Ukraine produce a lot of the food that is consumed around the globe. A lot of their exports go to Africa. And with the disruption in the planting season in Ukraine, we will see what is estimated to be a 40 to 45% reduction in the number of crops that will be exported then, produced and exported from Ukraine. So not only are they facing food insecurity in Ukraine now because of the war, but what they're able to produce as the breadbasket of Europe will not be going to those countries that are in desperate need of food. And David Beasley is the head of the World Food Bank through the United Nations. And we've had many discussions with David on this issue. And he made a statement to us that was really disconcerting for me in a country where we have so much, and in Iowa in particular, where we produce so much. David had said they are coming to a point where they will have to decide to take food from the hungry to provide for the starving. And I hate that. I hate that. Where we have so much, and Ukraine has had so much. They produce so much. They produce, I believe, about 30% of the barley and wheat that we see around the world. 30% is produced between Russia and Ukraine. So we are really, really concerned about this and how we can help mitigate some of those food insecurity issues. And that's just, in what's provided by Russia and Ukraine. We still have food insecurity issues in Afghanistan and other places as well, where we're not able to distribute food like we normally would. So a lot that I've thrown out there, it all seems very, very dark and heavy. And those are some of the topics that we're facing. But I always do believe in the greatness of America and our ability to step up when needed. And I think we are seeing what's going on around the globe. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to step up yet once again and provide those that are less fortunate, whether it's through the military aid or whether it's through humanitarian supports as well. So I am going to stop right there because I know we want to get some questions into. So just thank you all so much for being so patient and kind of hearing some of what's going on. Thank you. I might need this water too. Okay, but yes, please. If you want to even come forward or head to the microphone, we're packed in pretty good today. It's great.
First question. What are the Ukrainian resources on the naval side, from the naval standpoint, on the Black Sea?
Yeah, very little. So they do have some assets, but this is where the Ukrainian civil society, a number of their parliamentarians that I have met with, they are begging us to send our fleet into the area, because while they have a few assets, it's nothing like what the Russians have in the Black Sea right now. And the Russians are using their naval platforms to lob missiles into Ukraine. So in Mykolaiv, not only do they see missiles coming in from Crimea, but you will see the Russians trying to target Odessa, which is another extremely important community on the Black Sea. They are targeting them with missiles coming from the Russian naval assets. So this is where it starts to get very tricky, because we can have a presence there, but the point is that we can't interdict Russians directly. So we can provide them with surface to air missiles and things that they can use, but we can't use our own warships against the assets that the Russians have. And the Ukrainians, while they have just a few, they're very limited in what they can do with a Navy. So this is an area that we have to think through very carefully, but we're trying to find ways of projecting strength and showing deterrence, or some level of deterrence, to the Russians without engaging them directly. Excellent question. Thank you.
Senator Grassley, your friend,
Oh,
Senator
well, thank
Grassley.
you. Yes.
Is he here? No, Senator Ernst, this will be on climate.
Yes.
I think you would agree with the statement that it is rather hard to fight a forest fire with a garden hose.
Right.
Okay, so I think the implication is it's national, and I'm going to put in a little plug here. A local congregation is having a program on Earth Day that has been picked up. It will be a national webinar, and it will be on climate. And the author of that quote that I gave you will be our lead speaker.
Very good.
All right, so with that in mind, it is a moral imperative for all of us. Now, I know you just mentioned a little bit about electricity or how hard it's going to be. The question is, what specific federal legislation will you support that would relate to wind and solar energy?
Yes, and I'm very supportive of wind and solar, and the continuation of the tax credits has been extremely helpful for wind and solar at the federal level. And then also increasing the usage of our biofuels is one of my major pushes, because if we can go to E15 year round, we know immediately that the carbon footprint of vehicles, those that can use biofuels, will decrease by 40%. So we really want to push through those means, but I always think carrots are much better than sticks. And so if we're going to push for more wind energy, more solar energy, more biofuel usage, those tax credits are good. That's always the way I would much rather see. And I would mention too, as we look at electrification, the way it is structured right now, those that are manufacturing those cars, they're really not considering what it takes to mine for the rare earth minerals that are needed for the batteries in those cars, nor the disposal of the batteries that are in those cars. That's not included when they figure the carbon footprint. If we're going to be honest with the American people, we need to make sure that we are looking at the entire life cycle of vehicles and batteries. And not to mention the fact that now a lot of those minerals will come from resources that are Chinese owned. They use slave labor in their mining. They use children as they are mining and putting together the resources for those batteries. So while you say it is a moral imperative that we take a look at this, yes, it is a moral imperative that we take a look at it. And we need to look at all aspects, whether it is the usage of petroleum, or whether it's the usage of slave labor, whatever it might happen to be. We just need to be very honest and open with the American people about every aspect of how we might be affecting the climate as we move forward. But when it comes to specific things that I would support, certainly continuing with some of those tax credit programs that are available, which do encourage a lot of our energy companies to engage in those areas. Yes, ma'am.
As a follow-up,
Mhm.
what efforts are being done at a national level to encourage reduction in energy consumption?
Well, reduction in energy consumption, I guess you can look at that in a number of different ways. When you say energy, I think we consume energy, whether it's renewable or not. So what I would like to do is encourage additional consumption of renewable energy sources. I think maybe is a better way to put it. But maybe where are you coming from specifically? On petroleum? Well, certainly my biggest push when it comes to petroleum or, more of the fossil fuels would be through biofuels. So that is one of the major pushes. I think as Americans, we do consume a lot of energy. Our business and industry will always consume a lot of energy. So finding those renewable sources, whether it's through wind energy, through solar, that's wonderful. And we've really taken a lead in those areas here in Iowa. But large in part, directly replacing petroleum, I think one of the best ways is through those renewables. And that's probably not getting to the answer that you want to hear or know, but everything we do, we're utilizing energy in one way or another. So maybe I'm not following the question, but yeah, I mean, we're going to consume energy as a nation. It just is where do you get that energy from?
What is your sense in the Senate of how the Chinese are looking at Putin? And the reason I ask the question is because what Putin has done is hardened the American approach and wakened up the Europeans to what real aggression is like. And so when they are anticipating taking up Taiwan and other areas around the South China Sea, they should be very upset with Putin for spilling the idea.
Yeah, and this is where we've seen actual collaboration between the Chinese and Putin. And China will not come out and directly condemn the war in Ukraine. They will condemn the violence, but not the actual act of the war. So you won't see them voting against Russia when it comes to the United Nations, any surrounding activities. But yes, so Russia has gotten ahead of them. There was an agreement to wait until after the Olympics. We do know that now. So China knew ahead of time that Russia was going to do this. And while they didn't want to be part and parcel to it, they got the Russians to wait until after the Olympics. So they didn't steal the headlines, excuse me, away from the Chinese. So yes, the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine, there is a lot more attention on Taiwan. But the lack of in placing sanctions before the invasion happened, a lot of that, when you're reactionary, I pushed very hard to try and get sanctions in place before Russia invaded Ukraine. The administration's posture was, we'll put sanctions out there if Ukraine gets invaded. I'm sorry, but once a country has invaded another country, you're not going to get them out. You're not going to get them out, not by then putting on low-level sanctions. That's not going to happen. So lives have been lost. We see Russia digging in now in the Donbass. But because of that now, we're wary of what they might see for Taiwan. And I think we need to be proactive. The lesson learned for the United States is to be proactive. So we need to let China know, okay, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Oh, by the way, we're sending additional military assistance into Taiwan. We are going to arm them even more. so that it's pre-positioned. And if you attempt to go in, they will have the military ready to go. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do now. But certainly China's watching this whole thing unfold and gauging how they then approach Taiwan. Mhm.
Senator, thank you for your bipartisan and tripartisan efforts so
Yeah,
far.
thanks.
A question, some of us are older than you, and we remember.
Maybe
John
not by
Kennedy,
much. Yeah.
Maybe quite a bit. Some of us remember John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower,
Yeah.
and then Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, and they reached across the aisle very well. What can be done this year, next year, and a little bit on the road to increase that bipartisanship efforts in the Senate and Congress?
Mhm. Now, I think this is one of the biggest debates and questions we get as we're out doing town halls and as I travel across Iowa. And let me just reaffirm to all of you that bipartisanship is actually alive and well in the United States Senate. It just doesn't get a lot of viewership on the news channels, so the media will not talk about the issues that we can get done together. It just doesn't draw the same level of viewers, and that's really unfortunate. I wish we celebrated the things that we could get done together a little bit more. So this delegation is like that example that I use. And the way I approached it is I know who I go to in the United States Senate, the people that I work with the most on bipartisan pieces of legislation, the people that serve with me on committees. And so we always approach them first. And certainly if they are interested, they will pile on. We were turning people away. We had House members as well that wanted to come with us on this trip, and we were not able to accommodate everybody. 10 was a pretty large group to take, but we are working together on a number of issues. Just please know that. It does get political, and that's the nature of the Senate and the House. I mean, we are political beings, and they are political institutions. So there are some hot button topics that we likely won't agree on. But on the areas that we can find a level of consensus where we can bring the middle together, we do. And that I love engaging in that space. One of the areas that I have been working on in the last 3 years was the Violence Against Women Act. And I had worked with Dianne Feinstein, and it got some political roadblocks thrown in the way. And I'm not going to go into it today. They were finally lifted. And I'm in my next term now, so I don't need to worry about an election. And so it's okay for me to move forward with legislation. But we finally reached a consensus on that bill, and we had it included as part of the omnibus. And I actually did have to sit down and Dick Durbin was a wonderful partner on this as well. Dianne Feinstein, Dick Durbin from Illinois, had to sit down and have a conversation with the majority leader, Chuck Schumer. And, that's kind of difficult for me because he has tried to thwart a number of efforts of mine in the past, but this was an area where President Joe Biden really wanted this piece of legislation over the finish line. And so they came to me and said, this is really important that we get it done. How many Republicans can you get on board? And I said, well, I can get enough. You just have to work with me. And we were able to come together and get that done. So 3 years and wonderful advocates across the state of Iowa that were engaged. We were able to give them a voice. And so it got done. One of the biggest efforts, bipartisan efforts that we've had in a number of years. But just, know and understand that we do work together when we find common passions. We're working together where we can. It's not going to be like that every single day, but we are going to work together where we can. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator. Do you believe President Trump won the 2020 election?
No, I don't. No, and I've been asked many times over, and I've responded the same. I can't speak to other states and how they run their elections, but let me temper it this way too, because I do believe that there is a level of fraud that occurs in elections. I have not personally been presented with information that would lead me to believe that the election was stolen. But I can tell you that I do think that fraud exists. And I think it doesn't matter what election, I think whether inadvertently or on purpose, there are levels of fraud. But what I can say is that here in the state of Iowa, we have probably one of the best election systems you will find in the United States. And I know that because I was a commissioner of elections at the county level. And so when people present me with pose different questions, I know how to go back and counter some of the discussion, because I know that we have balance sheets. We have to account for every single ballot that is sent out or voted. And I certainly hope that other states do that as well. So I can speak for Iowa. I can't speak for other states. I just know that personally, no evidence was brought to the United States Senate to show us any different. Okay. I'm sorry, we're wrapping up.
We're wrapping up.
But
We're out
thank
of time.
you.
Yeah,
But
thank
I
you so
appreciate it,
much.
Chad. Thank you
so
very
much,
much.
Senator Ernst, for coming. We really appreciate it. We
Absolutely.
know you're busy. And before you're off to your next thing, it's important that you take a moment and, if you would, autograph the back of this book.
I would love
We are
to.
lead sponsors of Raising Readers, and on your behalf and in your honor, we'd like to give this to a
Thank
child of their
you.
will. So please,
I love
everyone,
that.
welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks again, Senator Ernst, for coming and being a part of our meeting today. Thank you, all of you, for your attendance and all the good things that you do out in our community, and some good information for us to process right from someone who's very involved. So thank you so much. And if you would, let's stand and recite the four-way test of things we think, do, and say. Is it truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you.